Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Just gonna give it about another minute or so, and then we'll kick things off to let a few others trickle in. All right, let's start. So welcome everybody. Again, good morning, good afternoon, Happy New Year. Welcome to our webinar shared with Qantas, GHG Accounting Manual for the Cocoa Sector. Today we'll be sharing draft results from this extremely important piece of work that we've collaboratively developed with Qantas, as well as the participation of many WCF companies through the SBTI GHG task force. We've had about 20 companies participate in the various working group exercises and different meetings, as well as feedback sessions. This work taps into an important need that we have across the sector to have a standard, high quality, and best practice approach for the cocoa sector for greenhouse gas accounting that covers land use change, land management, and removals. And before we begin anything, I would like to thank the Qantas team for the extraordinary effort and hard work that you guys have put into delivering the manual to date, as well as the flexibility. Before we move into the presentation, just a quick point of housekeeping. We will have question and answers moderated through the Q&A, and Elizabeth will facilitate that. Also, just handing over quickly to Elizabeth to give a quick overview of the partnership meeting before we dive into the webinar.
Thanks, Mike. And awesome. Thank you, Angelica. So hi, everyone. Just a quick announcement, as Mike was saying, about the partnership meeting. As you're all aware by now, obviously the partnership meeting is taking place on March 19th and 20th in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and the registration is open, which you can find on our website. Early bird registration is going to be ending on January 20th. So this week is your last chance to be saving up to 29% on registration fees. And there's going to be some really exciting sessions taking place, including one on mapping your way out of the maze of carbon claims, where Hamed Machizada will be presenting on behalf of Qantas, and he and other experts from climate organizations, finance, and the cocoa industry will be discussing how cocoa sector can reduce deforestation and curb carbon emissions amid rising scrutiny, with insights on investment frameworks, actionable carbon strategies, and the economic benefits for farmers and cocoa communities. So we're really looking forward to continue the conversation with you there. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So we have two main speakers today. First is Angelica Rizzo, Sustainability Consultant, Climate Transition at Qantas, and Alexandra Stern, Land and Agricultural Lead at Qantas. And the agenda for today, we have 5 different components to the webinar. The first is the intro that we just given, but then also a little bit about Qantas and WCF collaboration on previous work that led up to this manual and resulting in this manual. Secondly, looking at core manual principles, what are the main objectives behind it and principles behind developing the manual. Then an outline of the manual, and then some key issues that have been addressed by this manual that are uniquely being addressed by the cocoa sector, and then a live Q&A. So with that said, over to Qantas team to start the webinar.
Thank you, Michael. So before diving into the core of the manual and explore the sections in detail with Alex, let me first provide some context on the purpose and the process behind the creation. So the development of the manual began last year, and it took approximately 6 months to complete. During this time of period, we have adopted a highly collaborative approach, and we delved into many complex methodological topics and discussions that we'll see more of that later on. The goal we had was to create a clear and consistent and comprehensive step-by-step guide that could help companies measure their greenhouse gas emissions and removals. Currently, companies approach GHG emissions for cocoa and chocolate production in diverse ways, which often leads to inconsistent results. So the focus we had was really to provide the cocoa industry with a minimum methodological standard, that not only ensures alignment, but also encourages companies to pursue more ambitious approaches. Furthermore, this manual focuses on 3 key areas, which are land use change, land management, and removals. Before even discussing the development of the manual, Qantas and WCF collaboration started back in 2022 with the guidance on GHG accounting methods for cocoa production that was released a year later, so in 2023. And this guidance focused on general carbon accounting best practices. During this work, we found that many cocoa companies use different methods for GHG accounting, and particularly for land use change, land management, and removals, which has been leading to large results variations and the lack of comparability. And from there, we identified the opportunity to develop a more practical step-by-step manual, which was built on this initial effort. An important consideration to make is that the manual is also aligned with the latest international standards, including the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance Draft. So the currently available version that was released in September 2022. And we have maintained close communication with the GHG protocol team to ensure that the manual remains aligned with the final guidance once that is released. Also, as Michael mentioned, the manual hasn't been published yet, as you can see, but we are very excited to announce that it will be available early February. So behind this manual is a quite remarkable team. Our Qantas team has been working closely with Michael and Elizabeth from WCF, and we have been supported by a network of experts and contributors, navigating the many discussions, feedback sessions, and reviews to ensure that the manual is scientifically robust and relevant for the cocoa community, and also is applicable globally. Now we will have a look at the core principles that guided the manual's development. So the first principle is collaboration. Over the past 6 months, we have engaged stakeholders across the cocoa value chain, not only within the WCF sphere, but also external ones such as the WBCSD, WRI, and CIAT on more specific topics. And we have reviewed over 100 methodological choices, hosted multiple feedback sessions with the SBTi task force from WCF. So the manual is really the product of an iterative process that ensures broad alignment and industry relevance. The second principle is the fact that we wanted to set a minimum standard while encouraging at the same time ambition. So the manual establishes a baseline aligned with the GHG protocol, but it also includes recommendations for companies ready to adopt more advanced practices. And in the next slide, I'll explain how the manual distinguishes between minimum requirements and the practices that we recommend that go above and beyond. So finally, the third principle is transparency and practicality. This is because the manual is designed to empower companies to make informed decisions, clearly understanding the trade-offs that are involved, and for companies to use the manual as a resource to take informed and impactful action, and not only as a set of rules. An important note we like to make is that, of course, the manual is not legally binding. So companies have the flexibility to adopt the approaches that are described in it, but understanding that the objective that WCF and Quantis had with the development of this document is to enhance industry alignments, comparability, and consistency across the entire industry. So the manual is a great tool where to start from. Now, as I mentioned, the manual categorizes requirements into minimal and recommended. Minimum requirements are aligned with the GHG protocol, and they provide consistent baseline for all of the companies, whereas recommended requirements push for greater ambition, and they sometimes fill the gap in existing guidance. We have also included a third category of additional practices that support the minimum requirements. So you'll find this structure throughout the entire manual, ensuring that regardless of where your company is starting from and the resources that you have available internally, there is a clear path forwards and options that you can choose from. Just to conclude, before giving the mic to Alex, to make the implementation easier, we have also included practical checklists in the annexes of the manual. So the first one that you can see on the left side summarizes both minimum and recommended requirements, while the second one provides clear guidance for documenting removals, remote sensing methodologies, and allometric equations. So these are tools that hopefully will make it easier for companies to follow the manual effectively and validate the process as you go forward. Great. Now, with this foundation in place, I'll pass the mic to Alex, who will guide you through the manual itself and explore the sections in more detail.
Thanks, Angelica. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to, as Angelica said, kind of talk us through the contents of the manual by walking us through the outline. So the manual is divided into 10 different sections. This first slide talks about the first 4 sections, which are kind of the core and the foundation for strong greenhouse gas accounting. This includes an introduction, a section on traceability, definitions for plot area and cocoa volume, and also a section on sampling design. The introduction is just a general overview of what can be found in the manual, but it also includes some of the topics that Angelica was covering, those recommendations versus required minimum to align with the GHGP. The traceability section starts to discuss some of those chain of custody models, those mostly identified or defined by ISEAL that will help companies to align with the greenhouse gas protocol. So showing exactly how companies can have these models in place to inform their traceability. The next section on plot area and cocoa volume really gives definitions for how do you understand your area for assessment? What is that geographic boundary? And then for cocoa volume, what is the unit of analysis? So what exactly are you quantifying based on? For sampling design, this section helps companies understand, based on their larger population, how they can develop a smaller sample to collect information from, and have that sample provide statistical accuracy and also representativeness. The next 3 sections, 5, 6, and 7, really cover some of the core greenhouse gas accounting methods. It's the step-by-step clear methods for quantifying LUC or land use change emissions, LM or land management emissions, and removals. In the land use change emission section, there's very clear step-by-step processes for quantifying both direct land use change and jurisdictional land use change. It also provides information on publicly available data sets that companies should be using to quantify direct or jurisdictional land use change. Further, it provides some information on how to manage those verified deforestation and conversion-free volumes. The land management section is focused primarily on the data needed for land management emissions. So it focuses in on the primary data that companies could be collecting for tracking change or tracking progress over time. It also provides some information on the secondary data that can be used, the wide range of data sources that are out there for things like nitrogen content in fertilizer, or secondary data on yield to compare to your primary data that you've collected. Finally, the removal section here really covers the requirements laid out by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, specifically focusing on things like the requirement for monitoring or permanence, and then also the concept of additionality, which is not necessarily in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but is covered here as one of those recommended steps. This section also discusses buffer pools, defines how you would use them, talks about how carbon stocks are measured in agroforestry systems and other interventions, and then how to use or integrate remote sensing data when quantifying removals. The next two sections are really about integration. So section 8 takes from the previous three sections that quantified land use change emissions, land management emissions, and removals emissions, and gives the equations for quantifying all of those together. And this then takes it a step further for companies to understand if they have co-products, how do they perform allocation, and then how do they actually derive an emission factor based on the total volumes that are produced within different areas. Section 9 covers those derivatives that you have after cocoa production. So it covers how do you take emission factors for cocoa and then get an emission factor for something like cocoa powder, cocoa liquor, etc. The last section is on rebaselining and tracking progress. So this section covers when do you need to rebaseline and how do you approach rebaselining based on the data that you have. This section also defines progress. So this is progress that can be reported, and it differentiates it from other changes that you might have within your data. So data changes, methodological changes. So you might see differences in your results because of those that are not necessarily considered progress. It also talks about how to disentangle some of these things like active progress because you have an intervention, but also you've made some data changes or have methodological changes. As you can see, the manual covers a very wide range of topics that ultimately allowed for coverage of a lot of different issues to be addressed. In the next section, I'll discuss some of these key issues that were addressed by the manual. So as Angelica had mentioned, prior to this manual, cocoa companies were looking at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for understanding of how to assess their corporate footprint. And this leaves a wide space for interpretation. It also brought up many different questions and allowed companies to complete their corporate footprints in many different ways. It unfortunately, but also fortunately, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol needs to be open so that it allows for companies to have different interpretations because it covers such a wide range of sectors. But here with World Cocoa Foundation, because we're dealing just with cocoa, we're able to zoom in a little bit more and make some of these decisions. So really the primary accomplishment of this manual is that it provides very clear steps for greenhouse gas accounting within cocoa supply chains so that the methods used across different companies are aligned. Another really big accomplishment of this manual is that this alignment came through collaboration. So companies came and shared their different interpretations and understandings, and different stakeholders shared how some challenges that they have in collecting data and interpreting data. And all of this was integrated into these agreed upon steps for the minimum requirements for greenhouse gas accounting in cocoa. So ultimately, this allows for results comparability. When companies are using similar or the same methods and following these same minimum requirements, we can trust that the results will be more comparable. The manual also started to address many of the questions that companies had when interpreting the greenhouse gas protocol. So I'm sure many on this call are aware there are a lot of questions associated with how do you quantify land use change emissions, land management emissions, what's appropriate for removals. So this manual really gets at a lot of these important questions. And the next slide will cover some of these challenges and questions that were discussed not only in the manual, but also during our multiple rounds of review. So this is not an exhaustive list at all. There were many, many questions covered, but these were just a few that came to the top, particularly when we had meetings and discussions around questions and I don't want to say disagreements, but just misalignments, and where we've come to agreement and alignment in the manual. So some of these topics include things like, should the carbon in cocoa trees be counted as removals? What do you do when your satellite imagery is showing tree cover loss on a cocoa plantation? Would you include pre-existing trees that are not a part of your current intervention in your removals accounting? How do you define your sample size? What methods do you use to define a sample size, and what confidence level should you be using? What is the best available data that's publicly available that companies should be using for direct land use change and jurisdictional land use change, and how should this be used? So like I said, this is not an exhaustive list. The manual really covers a lot of different questions that have come up and generally draws alignment across companies related to answering these questions. So now I'll go ahead, and I believe the next slide is opening up to questions. So our team is here now to answer your questions on the manual construction, on some of those alignment points, things like that. We also have some questions in our question bank from the multiple rounds of review that we're happy to cover, but at this point, I'll just open it up to the Q&A.
We have received a message saying that the Q&A wasn't working. If anyone has questions and unfortunately cannot use the Q&A function, can you just leave them on the chat maybe?
Yeah, thanks, Angelica. So Elizabeth just unmuted, I believe, the microphones, just in case the chat is not working. If anybody has questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Okay, Angelica, do you maybe want to start with the formulated question that you have already, just to kick things off? Pre-formulated question.
Sure. I also see that there are some questions popping up in the Q&A right now.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So let's start with that. So there's a question from Pedro. can you please confirm that comparing SLUC with JD-LUC and D-LUC is not allowed, and that comparing JD-LUC with D-LUC is allowed?
I'm happy to start us off here, and I might invite my colleague Thierry to also chime in, or some of my other Qantas colleagues. So when we're thinking about statistical land use change versus direct land use change, it's very clear that these metrics are entirely different. They are unfortunately not comparable. Statistical land use change is going to be giving a broad picture based on country level, generally country level data, and shifts in forest cover. So I like to think about statistical land use change more as a risk assessment value. I do think that whether a company is reporting SLUC or DLUC, it is very nice to assess SLUC to understand what is your risk within a given country. DLUC, on the other hand, is directly connected to the area that is producing a crop. And the methods associated with quantifying those emissions are very different than the statistical land use change emissions, and therefore it does not make sense to compare them. Instead, like I mentioned, it's nice to actually do both metrics so you can understand your risk and then your actual impact. Thierry, did you want to add something?
Sure, yeah. I think it's really important that you highlight this part for the common understanding. And I think going from JD-LUC to D-LUC is something we envision to be allowed to be tracked as progress, although we want to tell you to be cautious how you communicate about it, because it might not be active progress. But we see, that a lot of companies struggle with reporting progress from when they didn't have traceability. So maybe we need to check the guideline to make this crystal clear. Oh, thanks, Angelica. Does this answer your question, Pedro?
Just to add to Pedro's question, so the intention of how the manual was written in regards to DLUC and JD-LUC is that for companies that have polygons or geolocations for plots in the direct supply chain, then the DLUC is the recommended approach. And for those areas where you do not have the polygons or the geolocations, but you do have the cocoa mask, then the JD-LUC is the recommended approach. And the idea is that both should be complementary so that companies who have the polygons for the direct supply chain, but then do not have polygons for their indirect supply chain, can use DLUC for direct and JD-LUC for indirect. The statistical land use change is for companies that don't have either. And the idea is that that is not supposed to be complementary to the first two. So that just is the original intention of what is written in the manual. Thierry, anything to add to that, or?
No, thanks for putting this into context, Michael. That's great.
Okay. Pedro, do you have any further follow-on question to that response? Feel free to just speak up. All right, let's move to the next question. We have a question from Courtney. If a company has 5 cocoa plots and only 2 of them are actively producing cocoa, does the company need to account for the land use emissions associated with the other 3 plots?
I can start us off, and Alex, feel free to jump in. So we see that quite a bit of company would not have this information. If you have it, that's great. Usually the impact in a year should be reflective of what you sourced in that year. So I would say if you really know that you source from only 2 cocoa plots, then you should only account for those. But maybe keep in mind that there is uncertainties related to the assessment, and if you reduce the amount of plots that you use in your assessment, your baseline might be, or your years of land use change emissions might be a bit more jumpy than if you use a bigger sample, let's say. But if you can say certainly, yes, we only source from those active farms, then I would only include them in your assessment year. Alex, does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. The goal here is to assess your current supply chain, as Terry mentioned. So if you know that some plots are no longer within your supply chain, then that makes sense to not include them. The only thing I can think is cocoa systems are constantly growing and evolving. And if you know that the system will be in your supply chain in years to come, it might make sense to continue to collect data there. So just to be thoughtful and know, okay, maybe next year this plot will be in my supply chain. So it could make sense to just continually monitor.
Great. Thank you, guys. We have a question from Julie Stasiuk. When will the GHGP land sector guidance be finalized?
So at this point in time, I believe the date is early this year, or in the spring. So March, the last conversations I've had with WRI, which again, this is not within Qantas's control. This is WRI and its working groups, is earlier this year in the spring. If others on this call have had conversations with WRI more recently and have more specific dates or thoughts on if that March or spring date is realistic, I welcome you to please also chime in here.
Yeah, and just to add, in our joint Qantas WCF call with GHGP, they mentioned what you said, but they also said that there is no firm date right now. Okay, we have a question from Faith Perry. How should a company shift from SLUC to DLUC as better data comes available? Is it allowable to have some commodities using DLUC while others use SLUC within their inventory?
I think on the first part, there is I think it's chapter 10 in the guideline, which tells you, or in the manual, which tells you how you can do this for some use cases in the context of changing traceability. And there is an example how you can maybe reconstruct a supplier history if you know the polygons were in your supply chain before you literally trace them. So there is a lot of different cases that tell you how can you rebaseline, when is it progress, and when is it just a rebaselining. So that should be covered, I hope. And whether it's allowable to have some commodities use in DLUC whilst others use SLUC, I think there's no way around it while we try to move towards DLUC. What you can do at the company level is maybe try to create a working group and move all commodities in a structured way towards having DLUC. But for now, I don't see any other way rather than mixing it. But Alex, again, please correct me if you see it differently.
No, that's correct. We have many companies that we work with right now that have statistical land use change in general across their footprint because it is required by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to include land use change emissions. So the statistical land use change is being used for commodities that maybe companies are not performing interventions on or are not material. Whereas they focus on collecting DLUC for those commodities that do have a material impact on their footprint that have implications for deforestation or major emissions associated with land use change. So definitely acceptable, but recognizing that these are different metrics. And as Thierry said, that section 10 on rebaselining is really going to be where you'll find information on how to switch methods, switching from SLUC to DLUC.
Okay. Question from Jesse McIsaac. How should historical data, in other words, baselines, be adjusted or integrated to align with the new requirements? Or retroactive incorporation of new data of consistent sourcing pools into a baseline?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this touches a bit upon the question that Faith just asked before on switching from SLUC to DLUC. Maybe if the question is a bit broader on land management, let me know, then we can then address this one also.
Jesse, do you want to provide some further context to your question? Not sure if you're able to unmute. Hopefully you are, if you wanted to continue asking more questions.
I was just saying, the last
yeah.
answer covered it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Question from Ryan McNeil. How will we handle farms that have less than 50% cocoa cultivation by a hectare, with the rest of farm being used for other non-cocoa crop cultivation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So for now, there is not a concrete part in the manual how to do this, but there is investigations underway that some companies are currently doing and might even, share this with the broader WCF group. For now, we just assume the whole plot is cocoa producing, knowing very well that that's a limitation currently. But I'm very hopeful, with the developments in remote sensing and with companies working on this, encountering these issues as they push themselves, that we will come up with a solution very soon. And one thing I could think of maybe is combining crop masks together with those plot areas that you only take the cocoa portion of the plot. But let's keep the discussion open on this one. And
Okay.
sorry for not providing a definitive answer yet.
Thank you, Thierry. Any other questions for the chat or verbally? In the meantime, while you guys are thinking and may add other questions, I saw, Pedro, you had potentially dropped off after we answered your question. Do you have any follow-up to the question? Do you feel that it's been satisfactorily responded to? Okay, we'll assume yes. Any other questions? I don't see any myself. Thanks, Pedro. I see.
I did just have maybe one follow-up to the question around the emission intensity aspect, which was talking about, the example of 5 cocoa plots, only 2 of them are actively producing. But just to clarify, all 5 will eventually be producing cocoa. And so the key thing being just monitoring those, collecting data, but we wouldn't include that in a cocoa bean intensity calculation. So that's kind of one of the questions of the farms asking, what is that emission intensity piece? And I think to make it a little bit more complex, if one of the plots is not actively producing, but there are cocoa trees on it, is that something that you would include in that emission intensity calculation? Because that's something in the manual, just getting a little bit more specific guidance on would be really helpful.
I see. Yeah, so I think technically it would only calculate the intensity over where you actually source from. So, if there's cocoa trees standing on there, you don't source from it. If there's no cocoa trees, well, then you don't source from it properly. Then you wouldn't include it in your baseline or in your assessment year. But it might be worth to monitor still the whole sample to make sure what you can expect in the future, in the next year. But I would say in the year you're currently looking at, only include where you're actually sourcing from, recognizing that you might have jumps because the sample size is smaller than if you went for the whole population. Does that address the question? Yeah.
Yes, that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, super.
All right, great. Any other questions? Group. If no other questions, Qantas team, anything else you would like to add or throw out there? No.
I think we had prepared
All right.
one other potential question coming up. If Alex, you want to cover it in case someone could be interested to that, and might also be related to Courtney's question in some way.
So we had a question from one of the World Cocoa Foundation members about high turnover. So across suppliers. So what is the best approach to manage high farmer or supplier turnover without frequent rebaselining? And we wanted to clarify with this World Cocoa Foundation member that when you have turnover with your suppliers, this does not mean that you need to rebaseline. This is the reality of your supply chain as it's dynamic and shifts year to year. Different farmers are going to be a part of your supply chain one year versus the next. In greenhouse gas accounting, we are doing inventory accounting, meaning that we're assessing your impact in a given year based on who you are supplying from. So that turnover is not necessarily a methodological change, and it's not a change in data. It is just a reality of your system. So it would not require a rebaseline. A rebaseline would be required potentially if you were shifting methods or data sources. And the manual goes in detail into what those differences in methods might be or what those differences in data might be. For example, for data, it might be that the background database that you're using for fertilizer or for emission factors might shift. You might go from using the World Food LCA database to EcoInvent. So that shift in data would require a rebaseline, but this type of shift, it would not be necessary.
Great, thanks, Alex. That's very helpful. I think we have another question from Clara Fast. As we start and continue to integrate this manual into our cocoa GHG accounting, will there be a working group, discussion group to support the process, either to field questions that come up to Qantas WCF staff or to share our experience using it with other companies? So there is no plan in the contract with Qantas at the moment for follow-up discussions. However, we do have the SBTI GHG task force in WCF. It's the same task force that participated in the development of this manual. And we will have interactions in the near future from time to time to discuss relevant topics. For example, one thing that we're looking to discuss with the group is about whether we want to pursue the co-development, collaborative development of a high accuracy approach to monitoring agroforestry / removals. So that will be an upcoming conversation that we'll have. And again, we may use that group as well for others to share experiences. If the task force would like to do so. Any other final questions before we wrap up? Yes, Natalie.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. Sorry. And this might be covered in the guidebook, so sorry if it's a redundant question. But for example, if you look at Brazil and you have land, that's degraded pasture land, right? So it was deforested a couple years back for cattle. If you wanted to do a kind of agroforestry restoration project there, would you have to carry the land use change that was driven by cattle there? Just thinking, if you had to, maybe it could prevent people from investing in like setting up agroforestry on this land. So yeah, just a bit to understand that.
I think that's a very good point, that it's not necessarily incentivizing companies to invest in agroforestry systems on areas that would be cleared or were cleared due to something else, because yes, those impacts are carried over. To assess land use change, there is a 20-year look back period, regardless of the reason for the deforestation. So it doesn't necessarily need to be associated with the cocoa production. I think that is a really good call out or watch out related to the land use change emissions. But I will say that there is the positive of this agroforestry system or intervention, that potentially you can see a change from grassland to a perennial system, which would reduce those land use change emissions. And then depending on how you're planning to account for removals, and this was a discussion across many of the companies and is covered in the manual of how you manage removals, you might be able to count some trees as removals.
Thank you for the good question, Natalie, and your response, Alex. Natalie, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. All right. Any final questions before we wrap up? Not, without further ado, thank you again to the Qantas team for the great work that's been done so far. Only a few weeks left before the final manual is published and available to everybody. Just wrapping up a few final comments. And thank you everybody on the call who has participated in this process. It's been extremely fruitful. And I believe that this manual is going to be very important for all of you and for the cocoa sector. Thank you again for participating in today's call, and just another call out to the partnership meeting. There will be a little bit more in that session that Elizabeth mentioned on this topic at the partnership meeting, as well as many other exciting topics. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Michael, and to the companies that participated to this process. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
good rest of your day.